Well, good evening, brothers and sisters. Please do take your seat and turn back to that passage that Pete read for us earlier, James chapter 1. If we haven't met before, my name is Alex, one of the members here at Hope Chapel. And just before the summer, we looked at the opening verses to this letter of James. And we're picking up together this evening from verse 9 to 11, where we left off just a few months ago. Well, once upon a time, there lived a man who was very, very rich. Indeed, he was so rich that he wore the most expensive clothes and feasted on the finest food every day with all of his other rich friends. This man lived in a luxurious mansion with a long private driveway and large gates at the bottom of the drive to keep unwanted visitors away. However, at those gates, on the side of the main road, you would often see another very different kind of man sitting. His name was Lazarus. And not only was he very sick, with his skin covered in all kinds of rashes and blisters, but he was also very poor. In fact, that's why he lived there at the side of the road, next to the rich man's house. For the only hope that Lazarus had of getting food was to wait for the rich man's servants to wheel the bins out for collection. So Lazarus could then rummage through the rubbish to find some leftovers from the latest feast. Indeed, Lazarus often found himself there next to the local scavenger dogs, trying to find a meal in the rubbish together, just trying to survive. Given his diet and his many diseases, it's unsurprising that poor man didn't last long. For sadly, the locals woke up one morning to find Lazarus lying dead at the side of the road. However, as the story goes, his fortunes soon improved, for it's said that the angels immediately carried poor Lazarus up to heaven. While on the other hand, when it was the rich man in the mansion's turn to die, his fortunes immediately faded, for he was sent to hell instead. Now, if you've read much of the Bible, I imagine that story I've just told will sound very familiar to you. And that's because it's a version of a story that Jesus himself told in Luke chapter 16. It's not clear whether the story is true or simply made up by Jesus to illustrate a truth like many of his other parables. Nevertheless, even if it is a parable, the point of the story is clear. Jesus used the story to teach us that our life may have a twist in the tale, that we may experience a final change in our fortunes. Jesus is saying that there can be a stark contrast between our present position in this world and our future fate in the next. And it's the point that Jesus often made. For example, he would say the last will be first and the first will be last. I wonder if those are the kinds of sayings and stories that caused James, the author of our passage tonight, to write these words that we've read together. You see, as we heard back before the summer when we started into the book, we learned that James was not just an early follower of Jesus, but he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and more than that, he was likely one of Jesus' younger brothers. Which means he would have been around during the ministry of Jesus, perhaps even heard that story about the rich man and Lazarus from Jesus' own lips. And therefore, it's unsurprising that story and this section of James's letter share a common perspective that cause us to consider similar points. The contrast between life now in the present and what it will be like for us in the future. This evening we're going to think about a passage in 2 points. First of all, we're going to take time to consider your present position. Your present position. What's your status now in this life? And then we'll go on to think about your future fate. Your future fate. What will your status be in the next life? How might your fortunes change for better or for worse? Your present position and your future fate. And let's think about that first one together, your present position. This is, of course, where James starts there in verse 9. Addressing his readers, he writes, "The brother in humble circumstances ought to take pride in his high position, but the one who is rich should take pride in his low position." James immediately draws a contrast between two very different positions in the present. The ESV succinctly puts it, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation." There are two categories of people there in verses 9 and 10. That first category is a general one, for James is speaking there of those who are in humble circumstances or who are lowly. It's those of low position, those of little significance in the eyes of the world. These are the kinds of people that don't have many Facebook friends or Instagram followers. They might not even be on Facebook or Instagram. They weren't popular at school. They don't draw a crowd. They'll never make it onto TV. They're easy to overlook, aren't considered important, impressive, or influential. Now, James doesn't tell us here why these individuals are of a low position in the present, but it doesn't take much to imagine some possible reasons, does it? For our world often overlooks certain kinds of people. Perhaps you're here this evening and you know this by personal experience. Maybe as you've got older, you find it harder and harder to make friends. You've noticed that people are less and less interested in you. A recent survey by Age UK found that 1 million people here in the UK who are over 65 say that they are lonely. That is, they feel that the world around them, modern society, largely just ignores them. And perhaps you who are older sometimes feel that way, that you're just not seen as important anymore. In fact, you're not just not seen at all. Maybe it isn't your age that makes you of a low position or that makes you overlooked. Maybe it's your family status this evening that makes you feel left out. You're single or you're widowed, and it just seems that everyone is busy with their partners and their families. You don't really have anyone to be close to. Perhaps you've never had children, and it feels that everything's always geared towards those who do. Maybe it's your health that causes you to be looked down on because you have a chronic illness or a disability. And maybe it's your lack of higher education or lack of a professional career that somehow seems to suggest to others that you aren't really that important. Maybe it's your ethnicity or your nationality that makes you feel left out. These are all kinds of reasons that mean that you may be seen as less impressive, less influential, not as important in the eyes of the world. And sadly, that can also be true here in the church, can't it? We heard about that in Pete's prayer. Sometimes the things that are happening out there in the culture around us affect what we do in here as the church. It's not just a problem right there, it can be a problem here too. We know that this can be the case because James will soon go on to address it here in his letter. At the start of chapter 2, he's going to rebuke his readers for making space at their services for certain kinds of impressive people, the wealthy, the rich, while giving other less desirable visitors far less attention. And that can be the same among us today, can't it? We can prioritize trying to reach out to certain kinds of peoples. Those who are maybe in cities, or those who are students. Or we can be busy just trying to attract certain groups of people to join our churches, those who are financially well off, or those who have young families, to the point that we neglect reaching those who seem less desirable, like the elderly or the sick, those who are in smaller villages or towns, those who are maybe a little bit lower down on the social scale. We live in a culture that is fixated on celebrities and social media influencers. And yet, if we're honest, most in our world are of a relatively low position, are easily forgotten, perhaps even deliberately overlooked. And that's who James is speaking about here. Maybe that's the low position you find yourself in this evening. On the other hand, of course, James speaks of another group, a more specific status that's at the very other end of the spectrum. For there in verse 10, he speaks of the rich. And it seems that he views the rich as the very opposite of what it means to be lowly, of a low position. Which makes sense, doesn't it? Because one of the quickest ways to drop to the bottom of society, become overlooked and left out, is to become poor. be poor can seem like the epitome of being powerless. Poverty is linked to all kinds of negative outcomes: bad health, lower educational attainment, higher crime rate, less family stability. The only people who are probably more overlooked than the elderly in our society today are the poor. So the opposite is also true. For the quickest way to the top of society is to accumulate wealth. Money can buy you education and airtime, political power, celebrity status. Money not only makes the world go round, money makes the world sit up and listen to you. Which is why when Jesus selected two characters for his story in Luke 16, he picked a rich man in a mansion and a poor man on the street. For it's harder to think of two people who are further apart in their present positions than those two men. Perhaps you're here this evening and you are rich. Now, of course, none of us are actually going to say that we're rich. We're not going to be as crass as that. And there's always someone who's far more wealthy than we are, especially here in Surrey. And yet, if we honestly assessed our position, we'd have to admit that many of us are perhaps fairly well off. Not only do we have all we need, but we generally have most of what we want as well. If we see something we like, we eventually buy it. If we think of something we want to do, we'll generally go and do it. If we hear of a nice holiday destination, we'll often go there. Maybe that describes you this evening. Well, if so, James is simply highlighting here that you find yourself at the far end of the social spectrum, that your experience in this world is going to be very different to someone of lesser means or of less desirable characteristics. And James is also warning you that your position will come with its own dangers and difficulties, unique trials and temptations. I wonder if you notice that that's the context in which this passage is set. At the start of the summer, we started to look at the opening verses of James, running down through verse 1 to 8 together. And you can see how the NIV has labelled these paragraphs there. It's called them trials and temptations. That's a good title for these verses. We started in verse 2 by hearing that we should rejoice in the midst of difficulties, and we should ask for wisdom that we need in order to persevere through. If you look ahead after our verses, you'll see there from verse 12, this theme continues. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Or verse 13, when tempted. Our verses are set in the context of teaching on trials and temptations. And so it's reasonable to assume that the verses 9 to 11, though it doesn't mention trial or temptation, is actually presenting us with an example of such a trial or temptation. The trial of poverty, and alternately, the temptation of prosperity. I don't know, I'm sure you don't need any explanation to how poverty might be a trial, how struggling in life might cause you to question your faith. And yet wealth can also be its own problem, a difficult circumstance that we find ourselves in. Maybe you're chuckling inside as I even say that, thinking, well, that's one problem that I would quite like to have. If I'm going to suffer for my faith, I'd far rather do it through prosperity than poverty, having too much than having too little. And yet when we turn to the Bible, we're consistently warned not to take this trial lightly. Indeed, some suggest that this is really the greater trial. That the greatest test of your faith comes not as a result of poverty or even pain, but rather through prosperity, where we are made so comfortable in this life that we stop longing for the life to come, where we become so powerful and influential in this world that we begin to trust in ourselves rather in the King that rules over all. Brothers and sisters, while the streets of heaven may be paved with gold, the way to heaven is generally not. Now, it's not that there won't be any wealthy Christians, but it is that there won't be many wealthy Christians. For as Jesus said, it's hard for a rich man to get into heaven. Or as James will later put it in chapter 2, verse 5, has God not chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith? And so it makes sense that as Paul looks out at the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 1, he would say, "Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many of you were of noble birth. But God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, so that no human being would boast in the presence of God." Those are the two groups that James is highlighting to us, the two positions he points to in the present, the weak and the wealthy, the poor and the prosperous. And we recognize that there are dangers, trials and temptations in both statuses. And we shouldn't be surprised if we look around our congregation, we'll see more of the former, the weak, than the latter, the wealthy. For that is how it has always been. And yet, if we just pause and think about these verses a little longer, we're going to see that there is a more important underlying division that James is trying to bring to our attention. For did you notice there that he doesn't just refer to the lowly and the rich, but to the lowly brother, or the brother in humble circumstances and the rich? Did you notice that? In verse 10, he just refers to the one who is rich, or the rich in the ESV. But in verse 9, it's to a brother in humble circumstances. That is, it's not just someone who the world is looking down on, but it is specifically a Christian who the world is looking down on. And by drawing our attention to that, James is going to show us that the greatest distinction in life is not between the weak and the wealthy, between the poor and the prosperous, but rather the greatest distinction in the present is between a Christian and a non-Christian, regardless how much money they have or don't have. You know, if you're familiar with the Bible, you'll know that this is something we read of again and again. Indeed, it's something that Jesus stressed again and again, telling us that there are only two paths in life, only two groups you can ultimately belong to the righteous or the unrighteous, the wise or the foolish, to God's children or his enemies. And which spiritual group you're in is going to matter so much more than whatever social group you're in. For it's that will determine your eternal destination. See, friends, the lesson of Jesus' story in Luke 16 is not that rich men will go to hell and poor men will go to heaven. That would cut against everything else that the Bible teaches. No, rather what Jesus is teaching us through that story I retold at the start of the sermon is that you could be the richest man on earth, the most popular kid in school, the most impressive employee at work. You could live in the biggest, most luxurious mansion imaginable, and it will mean absolutely nothing in the end. For money will not matter when it comes to deciding your eternal fate. You cannot buy or barter your way through the gates of heaven. While on the other hand, you could be the most overlooked and least impressive person imaginable during your life. You could literally be a man who lives on the street, sustaining himself by rummaging through rubbish, and still receive a royal welcome by the angels when you die. Friends, Jesus in Luke 16, James in our verses here, teach us that our status before God is far more important than our status before the world. How we're seen in his eyes matters far more than how we are seen in the world's eyes. I wonder what your present position is. What's your status in the eyes of the world? Are you weak or wealthy? Poor or prosperous? There are challenges that come with both. And yet the far more important question is, what is your status in the eyes of God? Are you a brother or sister? Are you part of his family or not? Because we're going to see it's the latter that will really make a difference in the end. Your present position. Secondly, we're going to think about your future fate. Your future fate. Every year in September, these weeks that we've just been through are important ones for our young people as they start back into education and continue to lay their foundations for the future. And the advice we often give to our young people at this stage of their lives is that if they work hard and do as well as they can at school and in their exams, they'll reap the rewards of that for the rest of their lives. And we say similar things in other areas of life as well. We're told to look after our bodies when we're younger so we can enjoy good health into old age. Or we're told to put away money into our pension now so we can be provided for in retirement. Work hard at school, advance in your career, care for your health, invest your money wisely, and your future will be bright. That's generally what we say to our children. That's how we at least try, or say that we try, to approach life ourselves. Which is why our verses seem so strange, for they paint a very different picture. They teach us that even if this life goes as well for you as could be imagined, even if your career takes off and you accumulate wealth and you buy the big house and have the nice car and have the family and the relationships and the friends that you all want, you could ascend to the very top in this life and find yourself at the bottom of the ladder in the next. For as James says in verse 9, those who are low now will be exalted then, and those who are exalted now will be humbled then. And not only does James say that this will happen, but he says that we can be so sure of it happening that we should boast, take pride in, glory in this reality. Friends, James is saying here, this is not simply just a truth that you should know, but it's one you should be regularly rejoicing in, reminding yourself of. If you're a Christian here this evening, I wonder if you do that. I wonder if you're more likely to grumble about the present or glory in the future. For James says that if you're lowly in this life, you should be boasting about the life to come. If you have nothing to lift your spirits now in the present, then you should be lifting up your eyes to look at the future. Is your body deteriorating and health failing? Then think of the new body to come. Are you often lonely, or do you miss departed loved ones? Then fix your eyes on your heavenly family and the eternal reunions waiting you there. Are you impoverished? Do you feel unimportant or unimpressive in the eyes of those around you? Well, then just remember that story Jesus told in Luke 16 about the rich man and poor old Lazarus. For isn't it strange that despite all of his prominence, we're never told the name of the rich man? And yet Lazarus' name is recorded for us. It's the rich man whose name is forgotten, whose legacy is ignored, and the poor man whose name is remembered. And brothers and sisters, that will be true in eternity too. The history books of heaven will remember the names of many who have been forgotten or overlooked here on earth. Perhaps even you. There in verse 11, James tells us that the rich and powerful will fade like flowers, that the wealthy will wither away. And yet, to paraphrase Jesus in Matthew 13, we know that even the lowest brother or sister in Christ will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. In the future, yes, the wealthy will fade, but Christians, we will flourish. And so we should stop grumbling about our present and start glorying in that future. Brother or sister, what ailment do you have that eternity will not erase? What hurt do you feel that heaven will not heal? In all the difficulties we experience here on earth, we should remember the glories that await us there. We should set our mind on things above, fix our eyes on our eternal future, of that glory which Paul can only write of in 1 Corinthians 2, that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. Friends, our future is so bright, we aren't even able to imagine it. And yet, James is saying here that we can rejoice in it. Indeed, that we are commanded to rejoice in it. James says that if we're low now in the present, we must boast about being exalted in the future. Take heart in our heavenly destiny. However, on the other hand, he says in verse 10, if you find yourself at the top of the pile in the present, then you can only boast in your future fall. That is, in your humiliation. Now, I don't think James means that you should be glorying or actually rejoicing in this, but rather he means it ironically. He tells us that if we are boasting in our wealth or in our strength or in our prominence now, then we're on shaky ground. For the things that we are most proud of will eventually perish and fade away. As he goes on to explain in verse 10, the one who is rich should take pride in his low position, as in, ironically, because he will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich man will fade away, even while he goes about his business. James is saying here that the wealthy man who boasts in his riches in the present is like the maker of the Titanic boasting in its design before it set sail. That is, setting himself up for an embarrassing fall. Or rather, to use the illustration James turns to here, it's like a beautiful flower boasting in its attractiveness as it sits there in the vase, only to be thrown in the bin a few days later. James is reminding us here that the very things that are most valued and desired by the world ultimately will not last. And so James ends there in verse 11 by stressing the foolishness of such a man who runs after these things. For even as he runs after them, he stumbles and falls. He never gets to them. He never finishes his pursuit. He fades away in the midst of running his business, which so clearly echoes that other story Jesus told in Luke 12, doesn't it, about the farmer who spent all his life building bigger and bigger and bigger barns to store more and more and more crops so he could have a wonderful retirement, only to die the very night after his retirement party, never to enjoy a single bit of it. I wonder whether that would describe you this evening. Are you living for something that will not last? Pouring your life into something you'll never see finish, never get enough of, never keep hold of. It might be wealth, like the man in Jesus' story, or here in James's verses. But it could be other things as well. For so much of what we focus our time and attention on in the present will fade away, will not make it into the future. Friend, your soul will last far longer than your stuff. Your relationship with God will go on far longer than any relationship you have in this world. And so James is urging you to give the most attention to that, to stop focusing on flowers that fade and to instead live for the eternal God who will exist forever, the immortal, invisible, only wise God that we sang of earlier. As the prophet Jeremiah put it in Jeremiah 9:23, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me. Friends, the only thing we should boast about, glory in, sing and rejoice over, is what God has done and will do for us. As we heard from Paul in Philippians 3 this morning, all the things this world values most, even many good things, are counted as a loss, reckoned to be rubbish compared to the worth of knowing Christ. Jesus' story in Luke 16, these verses here in James 1, teach us that it's far better to be a beggar and end up in heaven than to be a rich man and end up in hell. Now, of course, if you're familiar with that story in Luke 16, you'll recall that that's not where Jesus ends. For he goes on to tell us about the rich man's experience in hell, how he is tormented and anguished to the point that he just begs for a drop of water to quench his thirst, and pleads for a chance to go back and tell his loved ones of the terrible mistake that he made in his life. He wants to make sure that they have a chance to know that there is another way they can live. He wanted to warn them of the terrible fate that awaited them in the future if they kept running after riches, following him, living as he did. You know, if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, If you're currently outside of God's family right now, then that's exactly what I want to tell you about as we close. For there is another way you can live. There is something else you can run after apart from riches or relationships or whatever else that you are pursuing, that you're proud of, that you're boasting in this evening. For the Bible tells us of that one who was rich, truly rich. Rich beyond all splendor, perfect in every way, set in the highest position above all creation, and yet in love for your sake became poor, stepped down into the lowest place, took on human flesh, and died on the cross for sin. So that if you repent, turn away from sin and trust in him, stop running after other things and start walking after him, you can be saved. Like Lazarus. Regardless of how hard your life might get in the present, you too can enjoy heaven in the future. Find yourself welcomed in by the angels, seated with Christ himself on high, if only you begin running after him tonight. Friend, whatever wealth you might accumulate in this life will wither. Whatever strength you currently have in your body will eventually diminish. Whatever relationships you build in the present will have to be left behind. Whatever beauty you manage to maintain will fade away as surely as the flowers fade in the fields around us. But in Christ, in the Son of God, slain for your sins, you can find a reason to rejoice forever, a ground of glorying for all eternity. The riches of faith in Jesus Christ are more than enough to sacrifice whatever you may be clinging on to on this earth. Friend, don't make the mistake of that rich man in Jesus' story. Don't take pride in things that are passing away. Don't base your life on that which cannot last, but rather base it on Christ. Fix your heart to him. Set your eyes on him. And then no matter what your present position might be, your future fate will be glorious.